Hi, James. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Simon. How are you? Good to see
Yeah,
you.
very well, thank you. Just for our viewers, let's just do some quick intros. So we obviously know one another very well, but I'm Simon Spire, CEO of Data Agents. We are helping marketers close the gap between expectations of AI and the reality of actually how it can be used and deployed for better strategy, for data management, for execution, and for analytics. I'll let you quickly introduce Metacortx.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Simon. So hi, everyone. I'm James Perea. I'm the co-founder and strategy partner at Metacortx. We are a small consultancy business who are focused very much on bridging what we call the experience gap. So the experience gap from our perspective is the differentiator between how a business is selling and what the audience's needs are for what is being sold. And quite typically, we find that there is a big difference or a big gap in between what brands and marketers tend to think that people want and what they actually want. So our job really is to find out what those differences are and then think about how that can then impact the marketing strategy and then how that then it flows through the customer journey and the customer experience through various different channels. And that's where we get from strategy into execution. But we mainly focus on the CX and strategy, whether that's for B2C or B2B brands.
Yeah, that's great. And I guess that's a good place to start, James, because I think one of the things I wanted to talk about was whether it's sort of an idea of AI accelerated marketing, whether that actually means anything without a brief that's worth accelerating. In my view is that the brief has always been the sort of highest leverage, most important part of any marketing program, and AI doesn't really change that. If anything, it amplifies it. When I see most agencies, though, they talk about AI acceleration almost as a shortcut for saying faster production, which is obviously fine from an efficiency point of view, but your and my starting point is much more sort of strategy first. So I was just sort of interested about what point AI acceleration sort of enters your thinking and what your process looks like.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Simon. And I think there's the human experience lever that's really, really important not to ignore. Where we find that AI becomes a really useful tool is to do research and to find things out very quickly. So if you have a brand or a client and you're looking to understand a bit more about who they are, what they do, who their competitors are, look at their financial records, whatever that information is, it's a really, really effective tool for quick researching. So rather than you having to go off to find those multiple sources, you can use an engine like Gemini or ChatGPT to do that searching, and it will go and collate that information for you. But I think what's really important is rather than using that to say, okay, go and write me a brief, it's the human expertise of getting those inputs, how you probe those inputs, and then ultimately how you use those inputs to shape the brief based on your experience of the direction it should be taken in. So it's a really good tool for accelerating, as you say, Simon, but that acceleration is an acceleration of a process that cannot replace humans and human thinking.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think where we sort of see most value is sort of upstream in that sort of diagnosis, and AI can actually help you make that sort of diagnostic judgment very quickly in terms of what's the problem, where's the opportunity, where's the headroom, and potentially organize the data very quickly to do that. So it's kind of like the precursor to the brief, but then, like you say, the brief is, needs to be strategically led and something that's sort of driven out of the years of experience that we have in terms of understanding these things.
I would 100% agree with that. There's a real kind of focus that we tend to have on what we call the business analysis stage when we're first talking to clients. And it's really about understanding what are the business problems and challenges that a client's facing and then how we solve them. And typically that will come from experience of having done it across that sector, but potentially how it's done in other sectors and how you can leverage that to bring that into a client's organization and business. But you can get some of those recommendations from AI, but I think how you take that forward is something that is a real kind of choice based on experience. So that's the value that I think that we can add to our clients, Simon.
Yeah, totally. And you talked a bit in your intro, James, about the customer journey and that being your sort of key focus. In my experience, quite a lot of the customer journey is what businesses have sort of documented as the journey that they've designed, not the ones that the customer is actually taking. How do you think about the customer journey and I guess sort of not fall into that trap?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think quite often it is a useful exercise to map and understand what a client's doing, because quite often we find, unless the client is of a certain size and they've already invested in a department that is responsible for customer experience, quite often businesses don't even know their own experience mapped out, let alone what that real world experience is for customers. One of the things I think that's really important as part of that process that often gets overlooked is that customer experience really leverages talking to people and that human research aspect. But quite often those budgets these days get cut. So as a CX strategist, you always want to be able to talk to as many different people as you can, run interviews with various different people, one-to-one focus groups. And quite often what you find is that actually the budget gets cut for that, and you're ending up having to talk only to stakeholders in departments such as the customer services team or the sales teams. And of course, they can give you some good insights that will help to shape what the customer may be doing from their experience of speaking with customers. But I think there's no substitute for actually understanding and hearing it from the horse's mouth. And that's the bit I think that is critically lost. So we always encourage clients to do that. I think we get the best results from the customer journey to really understand that real world experience by actually speaking to them and documenting it.
Yeah. Have you done anything with synthetic audiences to try and, I guess, sort of get around that necessity to have customer insight and verbatim sort of first party research, but also the constraints in terms of time and budget?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really, really powerful tool. I wouldn't undermine it by the fact that it's not necessarily the same thing as the traditional approach of speaking to people. I think there's a lot of research out there from the big agencies, the Gartners and the Forresters and the Deloittes and whatnot, that can feed into crafting those personas. If you take, for example, in the B2B world, it might be that you're looking at a CFO or a CTO, and those audiences are very well documented in terms of what their needs are. Using those synthetic audiences gives you a baseline for understanding what they may need, and you can draw hypotheses for your customer experience and for your customer journey mapping and for the development of your messaging and how you go out to channels. But what I think is a really important stage there is that it may be able to do some of the legwork and the lifting that reduces the cost, but there should ideally always be a validation stage where, before you just kind of flow that directly in, can you actually take some of those assertions and hypotheses and test them with real people, just to make sure that whatever you've got in those synthetic audiences hasn't hallucinated or hasn't kind of drawn from something that may not necessarily be true or correct for your market. So really, really important to validate.
I think the other thing that I see, again, it's sort of prerequisite to really understanding the customer journey, but is connecting data across every touch point. And obviously those touch points have exploded now in terms of channels and so on. In most client businesses, that data is very siloed across different channels. And again, a little bit like you described, it can sometimes be in that sort of sprint to get to strategy, it can be quite easy to sort of compromise and say, okay, we won't actually access that data set, or we won't look over here because it's difficult to access. But I think it does only give you a sort of partial view of the true customer behavior. And so, you know, again, we've been looking at how do you rapidly connect that data so that you can make sense of it and make sense of those touch points. And then that also becomes really important in terms of figuring out what the success metrics are, so that you can actually then be measuring whether it's sort of new optimized version of the journey or the particular stage of the journey that you're particularly focused on is actually delivering benefit for the business or the customer, or for both.
Yeah, I think it comes back to that point that we were talking about earlier, where the business analysis piece at the beginning of the project is really critical, because when you understand and know what the biggest business problems and opportunities are, defining what success looks like there, or measurement, as you mentioned, from a high level business perspective is the groundwork, right? That's really about understanding whether your marketing project is going to be successful or not, whether that's about acquisition, retention, brand awareness and visibility. You know what the issue is, and therefore you should know then how to measure it. And there'll be some higher level things that you'll be looking at there from a measurement perspective that will feed up the chain into the, you know, the more senior leadership within a business. But also there'll be a suite and flood of metrics underneath that are more dials that you can tweak to optimize performance in various different ways, in various different channels. And the sum of all those parts, as you say, across that whole ecosystem is the bit that then drives the incremental change within an organization and within the marketing effort.
Yeah. And then been spending some time with clients who are sort of grappling with challenges that have come with AI and how that's changing the customer relationship and how those brands are getting discovered, the surface that they're getting discovered in changing from traditional Google search into AI search, as an example. Is that something you're starting to see across your clients and engagements in terms of the touch points changing, and how are you thinking about the impact that that's going to have on the customer experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think it has started to happen, and it's Pandora's box. It's out there now, right? It's not going back in the box, so it's happening whether people like it or not. It may be that certain industries it gets adopted less quickly, and for now, there's quite a lot of research out there that may say, Google search, for example, might be much higher than use of ChatGPT in certain instances. But of course, even Google search has its AI mode that responds to questions and is increasingly being used. So yes, we're talking to clients a lot. It's very interesting when you see, and I'm sure you're party to this as well, Simon, where AI gets its responses from. So the website and how the website is architected is naturally a core place as the domain that it draws information from. But there's also third-party websites, where you're published elsewhere are those reputable, credible sources, right the way through to things like Wikipedia and Reddit. So it really does impact the multi-channel strategy, where many brands may not have thought about the importance of Wikipedia or Reddit as part of their marketing strategy. If the AI is actually referencing those quite frequently within its responses, then it becomes a really critical part of your marketing plan to make sure that those are optimized for the searches that people have around your brand. And that's across all industries, how people are now looking when they're doing their research, looking into what is an itinerary for a day on a location that they want to go and visit. And if a website has got that itinerary listed out, or they've got social content that talks about what would actually happen on that day, then people are actually planning their trip, and a lot more of that trip in advance, rather than just looking at booking and prices. So a lot of the journey, I think, is being brought forward from a research phase. It's a lot quicker and easier for people to research across most industries now than it ever was before, which really puts the power back into the customer's hands. So you've got to be there in that phase, and you've got to show up correctly.
I think what you said is interesting, that something I've sort of started to see is this sort of question, do we still need a website? Because actually, the search and the conversation is happening in a chatbot. I think, like you say, actually, that is your channel, and it's the way that you can control the content and how that is being mentioned and cited in each of the different AI engines. So actually, it's become probably even more important than ever, and you still need to be thinking about how does that get optimized for people using traditional Google search, but how does it also get optimized for all of these different LLMs that are accessing and trying to make sense of that content?
Yeah, absolutely. And the good news for marketers is that there is quite a lot of overlap. It's a question that we hear quite often about, do I need a whole new strategy for GEO versus SEO? And actually, a lot of the fundamentals of SEO are also good practice for GEO. But it may just be thinking about what are the different searches that somebody would do within AI that might be a bit more conversational or a bit more kind of like long tail, taking it on as if it were a person, as opposed to just a Google search, which might be a bit more based on terms that they're searching around, and making sure that there's content developed around that.
Yeah. I think the other thing that I see is kind of the ownership, or the sort of breadth of people that need to be involved is perhaps sort of broader than just the marketing or the digital team, because it sort of cuts across product areas, and it might cut across PR, and you have quite a sort of significant group of stakeholders within a client business that need to kind of understand the dynamics of these new channels, but also then actually take a sort of coordinated approach to improving AI visibility and thinking about what that means for each of their specialisms, but how that then ladders up to how things are showing up in each of the AIs.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Disconnection, I think, is one of the biggest themes around at the moment. And we use the phrase quite often about disconnected experiences don't convert. And that disconnection we tend to see can be silos in various different departments, as you say, Simon, between product, sales, marketing, PR, etc. But it can also be the fragmentation of the experience across different channels that people are seeing, brands showing up inconsistently in social versus their website versus events versus packaging or whatever those things are. It's the symptom really, isn't it, of the fact that, more channels, more problems. It's more to manage. So I think finding that kind of red thread that goes through everything, how do you make sure that teams are aligned in the first instance within the organization, is absolutely critical. And then when the teams are aligned, you stand a much better chance of actually what you're putting out via your various channels that teams are responsible for, whether that's a PR team, a social team, a customer services team. They're all aligned to that kind of master vision and strategy. So yeah, absolutely a fundamental.
Yeah, I think it's always that the people and the process element is always the hardest, but also the most important thing to get right. I think, again, from a sort of data agent's perspective, we look at things in terms of data, people, process, technology. The data and the technology you can always figure out, but it's the adoption, it's the alignment of different people, it's the cultural change. All of those sort of things are the most sort of important to get right, but also the hardest to get right.
Yeah, absolutely that. And you have to have stakeholders within the organization and on these projects who are really bought into the idea that it's something that needs to proliferate into the business and be something that is adopted and is going to be a change from the norm, and to expect some pushback because, people are adverse to change within teams. People like to do things the way that they've been doing things. So it's something you have to kind of be prepared for. But knowing the success that it can generate and the results that it can get is the way to explain and rationalize the reason for doing these things. We're not just trying to make it up and sell it because it's fun. This is about optimizing your business for better performance.
Yeah. We went down a bit of a rabbit hole on AI search, but obviously there just are so many channels now involved, and you are needing to think about those touch points and those channels and how to sort of manage that complexity. I guess sort of two questions. One is, how do you figure out which of those channels or which combinations of things that are actually influencing behavior? And then the second is, how do you then measure whether that is true and whether that is improving the business performance ultimately?
Yeah, really good question. And a difficult one, I think, as well, because you are sometimes constrained to some degree by the channels that the client already has set up. Of course, you always want to make recommendations if you think that there are additional channels that can be used or leveraged, but it can be a harder sell, depending also on the capacity of the teams who run and manage those different channels and whether there's room for expansion. But I think we used to do this quite a lot in our former roles, Simon. You'll remember the role of the channel mix and having a really strong channel strategy where you look at each individual channel and you think about what the role is that channel plays and how it plays into that channel strength. I mentioned travel earlier, so I'll stick with the same theme, but the importance of channels like TikTok and Instagram for video content, which helps people to visualize what their holiday experience could be like in advance, lends itself really naturally to that part of the buying process or the kind of awareness and into booking process. So you should understand what the channels are. It's also about understanding if your audience is there. So you need to be sure that your audiences haven't moved away from the channels that you're selecting and that you don't have a channel mix that's dated by about 5 years or so, because things are constantly changing and evolving and audiences move to different places. I think that becomes a really core part of it. And again, the audience research always gives a really good steer into that, because you might make assumptions about where your audiences are. The channel may even have the targeting criteria to target those people. That doesn't necessarily mean that the majority of your audience are actually spending time in those places. So I think that's really important. And the final thing I would add on that is, for me, one of the things that's really overlooked is the idea of frequency within marketing. It's something that comes from the advertising days for those of us who were around then. But knowing that actually it's not just about getting in front of people once or twice on a really broad scale, but how are you getting in front of people 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times? The more times that you show up for somebody in those channels with the various different messages that you need to do to move them through the marketing funnel, that's where you really, really start to see success. If you just have a single ad that is trying to convert someone immediately and they only see it once, that's a really, really hard sell. Whereas actually, if you're able to get somebody interested and aware of your brand in the first instance, and then follow up with a message that says, okay, actually, here's something you should engage in, and this is why you should look into us and research us further. And once you get signals that they've researched into it further, you can say, okay, now I've got an idea that you're going to buy, let me put some conversion messaging in front of you. Then it stands to reason that that's going to be a far more effective way of converting people.
It's actually something I've just been working on separately, but this sort of idea of personalization at scale. And I think actually we've sort of moved into a different era now where, to your point, you can be picking up those different signals and then actually using that to make this, genuinely personalized decisions around what's the right message, what's the right utility, what's the channel that we should be using at a particular moment in time. So that it becomes more autonomous and something that you can start to deploy at scale. I think you can then also be testing and learning much faster as well. So actually the measurement starts to become less about, we did this for 6 months and now we've measured it and this is what the post-campaign analysis looks like. Actually, you can be making those judgments almost in flight because you're able to set things up and configure them in a way that is still true to the overarching strategy you've developed, but it's got enough flexibility baked in that you can still be discerning, actually this is working and this isn't, and constantly tuning things.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think one of the big issues that we're all facing at the moment is this idea of short-termism. All companies, are feeling the squeeze a bit at the moment, and everybody needs results quickly. I mean, they always have needed them quickly, but it's never been, more important now. And it's a really hard sell. We all know that we want to create a strategy that drives long-term success for a business, but no business will ever be interested in that long-term strategy if it doesn't also translate to some fairly immediate results. So the idea, as you say, of being able to optimize things almost immediately off the bat and see what's working and what isn't in a shorter time frame, whilst potentially some of the larger, more structural changes that you're trying to put in place, businesses really, really do see the value in that. It proves the value of the project into stakeholder teams, and if people need to present up into the board, that helps to unlock the budgets to make sure that the rest of the activities outlined in the strategy are carried forward because they can see some immediate success coming out of it.
I think the biggest thing that AI has done and is doing is sort of collapsing the sort of latency between the signal and the impact. And I think in that just commercial reality where everybody's got to be showing benefit faster, the fact that you can do things faster once you've got the strategy in place and you can measure it faster, it is only going to be a good thing. I think marketers have always struggled to sort of justify, actually, this is the value that we're creating, because, as we've sort of grown up knowing, there can be a long time between a brand building execution and the length of time it takes to pay back. And that clearly isn't going to change. But in terms of some of the more performance-based things that you can be doing, I think it's easier than ever to demonstrate the value that those things are creating, so that it builds more confidence that marketing as a discipline is able to create value for the business.
Yeah, and I think we've worked on a model that we find is really effective, which is simply run and change. And so quite often we talk to our clients about the run model is, how do we run that performance marketing? What optimizations can we make? What's the activity that we can do in a 30-day time frame or a 60-day time frame that can really make an immediate and fast change? And as you say, at the heart of that, AI is really helping to drive that optimization. Whereas some of those bigger projects, as you mentioned, whether that's brand identity refresh or kind of new messaging structures or new channels, then forms part of that longer term strategic initiative. But there's a really interesting exercise that we tend to use from a consultancy perspective, which is where, when you have your strategy, from your strategy, the operationalized version of that strategy should always have a roadmap of all the different activities that you want to conduct as a business. But that can be quite a scary place to start, because that roadmap might have a whole load of different things in it across different teams and different channels. So using a prioritization matrix where you can think about, okay, what is something that is a really gnarly challenge and is going to cost the business a bit of time and effort to do, and potentially money to do, versus things that are quick wins. And there's always going to be a sweet spot where things that have a really high value and high impact on the business that are quick wins, those should be the things that you pick off first, versus there might be some of the bigger structural things that actually have less of an impact, where you would put those further down, maybe in your Q3 or Q4 of your year-long roadmap strategy. So it's a really, really effective way to manage all those different streams of work by prioritizing them.
And I think one of the things that we've done well together, I think, is where we've used that that framework to sort of separate the quick wins from the strategic projects based on the value and the difficulty of doing them. But I think with the quick wins, it's still a trick in kind of making sure that they're consistent with the strategy and building long-term capability. So multiple quick wins ultimately should ladder up to something that is more strategic and long-term. And it's just, how do you actually get there?
Yes, and that's always a challenging part, because you might have an existing brand that's going to be reflipped and reframed in the strategic project into a new brand with new messaging, new identity, new tone of voice. But obviously, until that point happens, you still have to run with. But knowing and understanding when to flip and where to flip across different channels, that's part of the challenge. But again, as you say earlier, it's all about coordination. So within the teams, as long as you've managed to get all of the teams behind a vision and a clear plan, that's how you can make sure that everyone is aligned to this overarching strategy. So whatever you're doing, as you say, that's short term or kind of run, as we call it, is aligned to that long term strategy. That's the way to make it happen.
Yeah. I think that run and change model is interesting. Is there a sort of typical mix that you get in terms of, I don't know, is 60% of time and initiative spent on run and optimization versus longer term change, or does it just vary a lot by client?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it does vary quite a lot by client from my experience. Where it tends to vary is, what we do see quite often is, if you have an operational team, a very operational team, but not necessarily spearheaded by marketing strategic leadership, then the run model might be making the recommendations and the hypotheses to those teams, but actually they go away and implement those, and they're quite hands-on in terms of implementing them and managing that piece of work, which then naturally allows the wider team and agencies to focus on the strategic piece. But sometimes it can be the other way around. So it may be that there is strategic marketing leadership that you're working with, and it's enough for them as a CMO or a marketing director for you to hand off the strategy, and they're happy to own that bit. But where they're really lacking is the teams and the expertise to implement that within their channels, and that's where they're looking to hand that off to a partner. So that's where you would be much more hands-on with the run, and it might be that you're doing 80% of the run work, whereas actually the 20% is more the oversight of the strategy and just making sure that you're that extra safe pair of hands when the CMO or the marketing director is implementing that strategy, to say, yeah, okay, that all seems to be running on point and based on the strategy that we've agreed.
Yeah, interesting. And do you, I guess it sort of comes back a bit to where we started in terms of sort of diagnostics and understanding the brief, but do you find that you get a lot of clients whose starting point is almost a sort of functional challenge? We need a new website, or we need to do, a new account-based marketing initiative, or are they actually coming with more of that sort of expansive, can you help us figure out which of those things we should be doing and why?
Most often it is the more expansive business challenge, but they know which channels they want to implement it in. So it may be that they know that they've got a brand problem, for example, and the website is the main manifestation of their brand. So they're saying, okay, look at our website, we want to update our website because that's the key place that people visit when they see our brand, and we don't think it's aligned with our values or our mission or where we want to be. That said, sometimes you'll find when it hasn't come, maybe from the leadership team or kind of the senior stakeholders, it may have come from a marketing team where you have a marketing manager whose job and role and responsibilities is far more in the nuanced day-to-day performance aspects of things. And that's where they may be saying, okay, we've got channels and we need our channels to perform, to drive bookings, to drive sales, to drive whatever the different numbers are. We've got a retention problem, but they'll be far more hands-on in understanding how the channel works and how the channel actually drives those different business ambitions, and therefore their brief will be far more steeped in the nuance of that channel rather than only the business problem.
Yeah, totally agree. I think a sort of chat about a sort of shared objective, really, which is that we kind of want to be helping our clients build capability for themselves so that ultimately they can exist without us. And I'm just sort of interested in, how do you guys think about that? And how do you sort of strike that balance between being the external marketing department for some clients, where you're kind of, doing everything from strategy to delivery, versus other clients where you're doing more of the consulting and capability build, ultimately for them to sort of then run with it once you've done that program?
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting topic of conversation, because I think we're all aware that there's a lot of skepticism towards agencies and consultancies, particularly in marketing. And maybe for far too long, agencies have kind of earned their cash through the teams that they've got and selling the skill sets of those teams, as opposed to necessarily being embedded within the business and understanding what are the actual key skills that a business needs. And, is it better for the team to build out their own marketing functions or to bring in new tools? So this is really why I mentioned earlier that we position ourselves more as a consultancy and using a consultative approach than a typical agency approach. Because for me, the key difference is when you behave as a consultancy, you're in there with the business to understand what's best for the business. And what, if you were managing that organization yourself, what would you recommend them to do? And sometimes that isn't about, trying to get more work for yourself, but I think building a good reputation and doing the right thing for the client is the successful way forward for people to go, okay, these guys aren't just coming to try and get me to increase my budget. They're looking to do the best thing for my business, even if that's upskilling my existing team rather than outsourcing it to them. Actually, there's a layer of trust that you build there that means that the longer term relationship should be better. And we're banking really that if we get the long-term relationship right with our clients, then hopefully over time they'll invest more with us.
Yeah, I think we have a very similar ethos. We're building task specific bespoke solutions for our clients. So we're helping them figure out where can AI and specifically agents play a role and deliver most benefit for them. How do we then build that solution with it very much focused on the outcome that it needs to deliver? And then we charge, it's creating an asset that our client can then use and monetize in the medium term. And I think it is a different way of thinking about things, and like you say, it's more of a consultative led approach rather than trying to.
Exactly that. And I think it just builds trust. If you're saying, if a client comes to you with a problem and you're saying, do you know what, I can show someone in your team how to do that, rather than saying, okay, here's a big hefty bill for me to do that, then they think that's great. It definitely builds a layer of trust where they can then come to you with their problems and issues and discuss them and be frank and outright about the challenges that they've got, but trust you to help solve them. So whether that's, like you say, creating AI agents to solve those problems, whether that's about helping people to upskill on AI software, which we see quite often, helping them to use tools like Canva, for example, helping them to use tools like Claude for writing their own content, as opposed to being solely reliant on paying agency fees for copywriters. Of course, there's always going to be the questions around the craft and, does the AI job done by the marketing team have the same craft as an outsourced agency copywriter? You also have to respect the clients, their time, their capability, their capacity, and their budget. And, not everybody can afford the time and luxury of, hiring an agency and the outcost on copywriting when it can be done to a certain extent by AI tools. So that's just one example, but it's those kind of things where you give the client the option and let them choose. It's their business, it's their organization. We shouldn't be holier than thou and always telling people how to run their business. We should be helping them to give them options, but allow them to make the decisions that are best for their business.
Yeah, totally agreed. Cool. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, James. Let's pause there. Obviously, our contact details and everything are around the video, and I think it'd be great. Maybe we can have a follow-up and delve into a few more topics in the coming weeks.
Would love to do that, Simon.
Cool. All right. Thanks, James.
Brilliant. Thanks, Simon.